Can I just steer you over to the Democrats? You're going there.
Sure.
You're
Yep.
segueing over. Yes.
There's nothing I'd rather talk about than the
well,
Democratic
okay.
Party.
I mean, what we're seeing is they're a party bent on destruction, it looks like, and doubling down on defeat. And you see Nancy Pelosi as she answers the calls to get rid of her leadership, that in fact she says the level of attacks against her show how strong she is and effective she is. So given all of that, what do you think their strategy is? And maybe you could tell us why they lost these elections.
Well, I think the issue is very simple. The Clinton and Obama supporters want to stop people who think like Bernie Sanders at almost any cost. You could see that in the race for chair of the Democratic National Committee, for example, and it has shown up repeatedly in the decisions about which candidates to support in these congressional elections that they have uniformly lost. So that's the key issue. And beyond that is the question of what's behind that is the issue of what the party stands for. And to a considerable extent, the rhetoric about resist has been, I think, quite deliberately employed to stop people from asking, well, we know what we're against. We know we're against Trump, against attacks on immigrants, on race baiting, attacks on women. We all know that. That's pretty plain. But what are we for?
Right.
And in particular, the remarkable, stunning thing is, in this discussion of health care, the way the Democratic leadership has run from single payer. And single payer is very plainly the answer to the economic problems posed by medical spending.
So, right, this is the groundswell. This is what people want. And what was remarkable, Tom Ferguson, in the Georgia race was the way Ossoff just didn't talk about Trump care or...
Well, Ossoff was clearly a candidate to the liking of the Democratic national leadership, which is why they were willing to pile so much money in. Those other races, they weren't necessarily so favorably inclined. And, these other races, several of them could possibly have been won with a bit more national effort. But
like in my home state of Montana with Rob Quist.
Yep, there was one. There was Kansas. I'm sorry. Thank you. And Bernie Sanders was the only person, I think, who went out there of significant national stature to campaign. And the guy didn't get the support from the Democratic National Committee, and everybody was pretty bitter about it afterward, and they barely lost. And this is going to continue. It's not going away. The Democratic national leadership is in the hands of Wall Street, insurers, a lot of folks in the medical industrial complex that don't want single payer. It's the traditional sort of, if you like, corporate side of the Democrats. The issue before us, I think, is just very straightforward. Either these folks are going to control the party or the population is going to control it. And this is the question. It inside the Democratic Party. Anybody who tells you any other issue is just talking smoke quite deliberately.
Well, Tom Ferguson, just to go on that, because now what we're seeing, if anybody in the listening audience has a credit card, they're getting notices from their credit card companies that they're changing fee structures and interest rate structures because, the Consumer Protection Agency is gutted. And now,
it's not gutted yet. Their proposals to gut it are legion. And there you'll find, I think, some Democrats, notably Elizabeth Warren, will stand up. Warren's also belatedly, but look, it's an amazingly gutsy thing to do. No point in, she has now said, look, single payer is clearly the way to go. She's a little slow to jump on the telecom issues because of the efforts, the way the Trump administration has handed the FCC over to issues on network neutrality. But, this is actually an important issue that Democrats need to get on because the people who really get hammered on these efforts to wipe out network neutrality, in other words, treating everybody as an equal sort of source to get on the Internet, no two-speed Internets, are rural America because those folks get
Trump supporters.
They often have no competition whatever in their districts. And this is a really big deal. It's not a minor issue. The telecom, finance, medical stuff. And the Democrats, mainline Democrats, have been wishy-washy, but generally better than the Republicans on network neutrality. They've been much wishier and washier on finance. But,
well, let's go to Dodd-Frank. I think goes into your first thing about Trump, and he was opposed to the TPP and trade, and he also said that he was in favor of restoring Glass-Steagall, but that's not what the reforms...
That's not where they're going.
So maybe you could just say a little bit, because also with respect, not the Republicans, but the Democrats, what is their position on Dodd-Frank, and in particular the Volcker Rule?
I think they're trying to figure out what they think. Elizabeth Warren has been quite vocal. The party itself hasn't had that much to say. Let me, if I could, back up to it. This is a very tricky issue to judge. That is to say, the strength of the various factions in the Democratic Party. Because the issue is this. I think the Sanders campaign proved that you can actually raise enough money to be nationally competitive. If Sanders had started earlier, if he declared running when Baltimore was burning and things like that, he might actually have won the nomination, because it would have been easier to bridge the gap between him and African American voters. That it took a long time for that to sort of happen. But what that means is the following: that the national party apparatus is typically going to be in the hands of the big money folks. That's exactly what's happened in the last few months. But once you get candidates named and people start to compete, then you'll see money and volunteers and stuff can matter. I don't actually think, though this conflict appears to be mostly dormant right now, you can see it if you look closely, it will come back to life in the 2018 races. Paying attention to how many subsidized Democrats there are is a really important question. The other thing that one wants to look at are all these new media companies that use the internet. They often, when you study them, turn out to be owned by hedge funds and other operations that clearly have axes to grind.
Can I just interrupt, because here's an issue that the Democrats have not come out against, getting rid of the special privilege for hedge fund managers, which has carried interest.
That's
and then
right.
on the other hand, what you're saying is showing how the traditional forms of financing elections can be upended by very massive mobilization, as we've seen with Sanders. So, but on the other hand, I guess on the third hand, the Sanders forces are caught between a rock and a hard place, because they're inside the Democratic Party, where the leadership hates them and opposes them, and they don't have a lot of choices. So maybe you can kind of speak about all of these issues.
I still think that the institutional barriers to third parties, which are erected by the two major parties, no doubt about this, and colluded on with big media in the sense that they simply will not cover third parties. You're long past any doctrine of fairness, and even when you had the fairness doctrine, they just didn't cover anything except the major parties anyway. That's probably not going to change. So I actually think, if you're asking me as a clinical, I don't like it. But if you're asking me for a clinical judgment, probably the best route is still dumping out candidates in primaries in the Democratic Party. You can get on the ballot much more easily than if you try to get on as a third party. You'll spend all of your time and money just trying to get on. And in that sense, I fear that at least for the foreseeable future, absent some court decision that would change things, which I don't see that happening. I think two things. I think it's clear from 2016 that enough money can be raised to get candidates going, at least in a fair number of cases. The other thing that I think is incredibly clear is that very large number of Americans now see that our form of American capitalism no longer works for most people. It is very plainly producing enormous riches for small numbers of folks, and that the chance for ordinary people to have careers, to go to college, to get just sort of basic fairness, to hold on to blue-collar jobs with unions, that stuff is all rapidly withering. And people see it. I don't think you're going to be able to contain that very plausibly. I don't think you're going to be able to do, Hillary Clinton did not win the election. Some statistical studies of that race have shown that the amount of time talking about policy, as distinct from candidates or something, was about the lowest in many years. The Democratic line has been, we're not Republicans. That's not going to be good enough.
Not at all.
I think. And I think these folks are vulnerable. I'm not somebody that has been walking around telling you for 20 years things are going to get better, but I actually think these folks are beatable. I think the times are running against them.
Well, that's what I wanted to end with, because we are out of time. But in any case, it does pose a conundrum because, as you say, the leadership has their ties in the Democratic Party, have their ties to finance, and they hate the Sanders forces. And yet the American public doesn't like them and have shown that in every single election.
Nope.
So let's just
These guys are losers now, I think. Bernie Sanders jibed that they'd prefer a first-class cabin on the Titanic. That's exactly right.